So today's guest on the Keen on Yoga podcast is Ruth Westoby. She's a doctoral candidate at SOAS. I can't remember what the topic of your thesis is, Ruth.
Yeah, bodies in early Hatha Yoga is my thesis. I'm looking at models of the yogic body, so how the body is described in the sources, and then how should we understand yogic body models of Kundalini, Bindu Rajas, and like baking the body. So if physical techniques work, if that's the kind of rationale or raison d'etre of the early Hatha corpus, that physical yoga techniques are efficacious, then what is their understanding of the body, and how should we understand the yogic body as material physical and sort of yogic, or what is frequently described as subtle body, or like sukshma sharira, kind of how's all that coming together such that the process of yoga delivers power and liberation.
And we did start a topic, a discussion on this, but it was quite complicated. So today I think that what we decided to talk about was the relationship between academia and study. And you can see that Ruth is certainly an academic and also a practitioner. Ruth has practiced, I think, Ashtanga Yoga in London with Hamish Hendry for many years, right? Is that right?
Yeah. I started yoga when I was 16. I went along to yoga class with my mum, who took me to, I guess, Hatha Yoga, you'd call it. Just, you probably define it as village hall Hatha Yoga, just in a college in Hereford. And actually, the teacher was the mum of one of my best friends. So we'd do that, and then mum would go home and I'd go to the pub. So yeah, that's how I started. And I went along with another really good friend who went the Iyengar route. So she now has a local yoga studio, and I go and practice with her. And then I moved to London to do my undergraduate, and Norman Blair became my teacher, and I practiced with him for a few years. And then he took me to Hamish's, and the sweet man got up really early because I had to go before work, met me at the tube, took me for Hamish's, put my mat out next to him, and I just copied him because I didn't know the sequence. So kind of got through a bit of primary, and then was like, whoa, this is all really hot. I really want a drink of water. So I think I started with Hamish in the early 2000s, and when they were at Diorama. Right. And then continued practicing with him in a sort of very much a sort of family relationship of like, you have your highs and your lows, but I think it's definitely my home.
Sorry, you're saying your other teacher?
Well, I'd say the most influential teacher is Richard Freeman and Mary Taylor. I did their teacher training. I don't know, in like 2008 or 9, and then try to practice with them whenever they come over to the UK. Yeah, so definitely super influenced by Richard and Mary.
Yeah, I think like so many people, really. I was talking to someone the other day and saying, before Richard came along with these ideas of technique, there's really like not any idea other than just trying to get yourself into the posture, right? I think Richard, he did so much to kind of develop and evolve Ashtanga Yoga, and incredible. And Mary, in fact, as well. Had Mary in the podcast as well. She's fantastic as well. And a good chef, it turns out, Mary's a trained gourmet chef. So we had lots to talk about on that front. Anyways, today, so we're going to try and keep on program. And today we wanted to talk about the relationship between academic studies of yoga, which I think increasingly people are getting into yoga philosophy, even if they're not academics. Most of us are not, including me. I'm no way an academic, although I talk to them and I like them. And practitioners, and most or many academics are also practitioners, or they got into it due to practice, and how the two intersect and maybe complement each other. Because some people will say, and I know that there was a lot around the modern academic scholarship, there's a lot of people kind of annoyed at the start or somewhat upset about, say, Mark Singleton's book or Norman Soyman's Traditions of the Mysore Palace, that is somewhat kind of debunked yoga, or somehow, a kind of cynical take on, so well, let's just start from saying,
I'm having to make notes, man.
Your own benefits. I was wondering what you're doing. I thought you maybe replying to someone's email.
Multitasking, man. This is just not interested in this.
Exactly. But yeah, I mean, I think that there's this feeling that a lot of people had when they got the works of, say, Singleton in their hands, that he'd done a great disservice to yoga in some respects, right? And I think this carries on to today, that the idea that it's kind of heresy to suggest that all the asanas didn't come from way back when, the Yoga Karunta, or had some, the Vedas even, exactly. So, I mean, it kind of spirals also into what is yoga and how, and the conversations about appropriation. But if we start at the start, what would you say is that has been your benefit through more study of the text, and do you see any pitfalls in terms of applying a kind of Western rationalism to a body of knowledge that doesn't really necessarily move along the same lines?
Oh my God, you are touched on so many things there. Western rationalism. Okay, right. So I like academics too. I feel like I feel very at home with people who are wildly interested in something to the extent that sometimes one's social skills drop off. But that's okay, because we're just nerds. So, and I suppose one way into it is like how I got into the more academic study of yoga. So, having practiced at Hamish's for a while, I said, so go on then, what's all this about? Give me a book. And he gave me the Bhagavad Gita. So I went away, got on the tube, read a bit of it, came back to yoga the next day, reading Gita on the tube. I was like, Hamish, he gave me the wrong book. It's like about a war. Have you read this? Okay, keep going. I was like, all right, okay. And I remember speaking to Richard Freeman about sort of the academic study of yoga. And I think when I went to do when I went to Boulder to practice with them, I was doing my master's degree at SOAS, which at the time was traditions. No, because now they have the master's program, Traditions of Yoga and Meditation, but that wasn't running at the time. So I was doing Indian religions, like the pathway, the Indian religions pathway of the sort of study of religions. And now I can't remember the phrase that Richard used, but it was like the problem with academic studies is it sort of turns you into I definitely don't recall the exact words, but it was, it makes you so obsessed by sort of facts and data and what you can prove, and you might lose sight of the flow and the glory of it all. Yeah. But I catch myself quite frequently with what I'm studying, sort of realizing how influenced I have been by Richard in terms of some of the things that he'll teach as part of a class. And then I find myself, years later searching for that through the sources. So I probably have turned into a bit of a, obsessed with stuff, with detail. You talked a little bit about Mark Singleton's work and Norman Sjoman's traditions of the Mysore Palace, both of which are just here. Norman Sjoman was the yoga tradition of the Mysore Palace. When I first read Mark Singleton's book, and then you asked about pitfalls of Western rationalism. I think there's a load of stuff to go in around like the scholar-practitioner relationship. What is that? Can one be can you divide them out? Are they always together? What are the risks and benefits of that connection? Is a really interesting thing to talk about. When I wasn't aware of the controversy around Norman Sjoman's book. What was the problem there? What was the criticism of his work?
Yeah, I think some people were pretty upset. I mean, Norman has been on the podcast, and I think he mentioned that some people were pretty upset at the time that he kind of was seeming to claim, basically kind of saying that it come from the Sritattvanidhi, that Krishnamacharya took a lot, if anything, from the Tatvanidhi and not from the Yoga Kurunta. And also that the idea that, he mentions in the book that Rama Mohan Brahmacharya, perhaps if he was existent, was more in a state of Karnataka rather than towards the Himalayas. That was
right. Okay.
That was another one of his in his footnotes. He also suggests that Krishnamacharya maybe studied rather closer to home. So there's a few things in there that
I had one yoga teacher who refused to give me a book on yoga. I was like, "So what's all this about?" And she was like, "No, I'm not telling you, not lending you the book. Practice, go and practice for a few years, and then read a book." So I can kind of see where you're coming from on that. So with Mark Singleton's work, when I first read it, I was like, oh my God, this is the discontinuity thesis. And that's how I read it. I read it as saying, look, this is what's new about the modern practice of yoga. But I think I was completely sort of wrong in how I was understanding that. He was doing a really specific project in his work, which was to analyze the materials produced in a short time frame. And to say, right, what are the influences in those manuals on physical culture developing in India? Okay, I'm going to get the time period wrong, but was it sort of the 1890s was his sort of key period? And he did a blinder of a job. Like his book, I think, is still 10 years on, absolutely groundbreaking. And I think it's fabulous scholarship, and I think he writes like an angel. I once contacted him and said, Mark, how do you write so well? What should I read to be able to write like you? Anyway, I'll just drop my standards and just try.
I know.
Not right like that. So I think the thesis,
right,
and I don't think he's arguing the discontinuity thesis. I think he's arguing. He's saying just what are the influences on yoga at that time. He's not saying there is no continuity, there is no historicity to this practice. He's just not. He's not doing that. But I think that's how the yoga community and practitioners picked up on that and felt offended that that the longevity was being criticised. And we care. I think practitioners tend to care really deeply about questions of authenticity because. I guess you and I and many out there have spent many hours on the mat. We're deeply intrigued by this thing, and we're really, really going as far as we can go into it. So you want it to be right, you want it to be true, you want it to be valid, you want it to have a purpose. And if people start saying, "Oh, but," like questioning that, it's really discombobulating, destabilizing, and like, well, what is the point of this thing if it's just I want it to have that historicity. So Mark has a chapter in a different book called The Classical Reveries of Contemporary Practice, which I think he's just been asking some absolutely brilliant questions. So and then I was going to
think that was I was upset by it when I read it first of all. Because you kind of feel that those, sorry to interrupt, because you feel that those postures, they have, when you're doing it, they're so strange, but they're also so challenging that you kind of want them to have some kind of further energetic significance or symbolism, And if you feel like when Mark points out that perhaps that they're taken from, the circus or, other traditions, of even Western cultural calisthenics, that you kind of feel like a bit shortchanged there. Like, well, is that all they are then? Just exercise when, I was taking them to be some kind of further energetic work, And I think there's a kind of maybe some conflation there between also a number of different systems. Well, one, you've got a system of Patanjalian idea within Krishnamacharya's matrix, and the other is a tantric one, really, And is it an energetic practice or is it a practice for concentration? Two maybe other sidebars as well that often get kind of joined in together. Sorry, it's going down another avenue, isn't it?
I think Mark was sort of saying that you've got a certain range of movements that the human body can make, and different practices do these movements. So harmonial gymnastics, Ling. You might find the same movements, and they may have cross-pollinated, but the conceptual frame underneath them may be different. So what you understand when you're doing something is unique to the kind of context in which you are practicing, or that series of postures have a meaning. So I don't think he was saying there's no meaning to these things. He was saying that, isn't it fascinating that the body can do these things and these movements are traveling? And what is what's the worldview underpinning them? And also, how postured, like the modern history of asana is really interesting, that sun salutations were not considered asana prior to the 1930s, that you don't have asymmetrical side bends before the 20th century. It's all very fascinating. I mean, I think some of the sort of broader overarching questions that impact scholarship, and a sort of that both impact scholarship and impact sort of the practitioner. Sorry, I'm in the UK and I've got my full season sleeping bag wrapped around me because it's pretty cold here. Oh, I'm finding it really cold.
Oh God!
It's just to keep the warmth on. And I had to turn the heater off, so I didn't have.
Yeah, I know.
So I think there are some kind of broader questions around like time, like how we understand time and how we attribute thought and scholarship and authorship. So I don't like sort of using the East-West dichotomy because I don't think it's that helpful. But in sort of the modern Western academy, the idea is like one person comes up with one idea. So my thesis that I'm desperately trying to work on at the moment, it needs to have this unique contribution to thought, which I read somewhere was like a polite fallacy, that a thesis can actually be a unique contribution, because of course we're all in this together. It's one big conversation and we're all feeding and developing, and your thesis is as much a product of the advice and scholarship that you have been embedded in than your own thing. Anyway, we have this polite fallacy that we can have this unique idea that is somehow ours and that is somehow sort of better than, and then we name that, what's the phrase that you've come up with that you can plaster all over social media that's your kind of unique contribution, and then you copyright it and stuff like that. So and I think we have a Hegelian view of time, like history is progress and history is improving. There's this kind of teleological purpose to it. And if you kind of take those ideas and put them into the Indian context, it just doesn't fit, does it? Yeah, cyclical ideas of time, but time is degenerating. We have the yugas, and it's a degeneration through time. So there is that cyclical purpose sense to it, but it's not teleology, it's soteriology. It's the sort of function of time is different, and we're trying to become free from that sort of round of rebirth. And then when you think about sort of ideas and new ideas, well, there aren't any new ideas. Like in the beginning was the word, and the word was Om, and the pranava is the reverberation of the universe from which the cyclic eons reverberate out. And within the pranava are all of the teachings. So all of the teachings are there. They're perennial. They are just articulated in different words at different times. So there is nothing unique. One person didn't think of this truth for the first time, and you don't say, well, I have written this text and it comes up with new things. No, you name it by your teacher, because that's a work, that's an attribution of the credit of those ideas to your teacher. And then so this is where the Western academic approach kind of hits up against Indian concepts of time, because we'll try and date things by like, well, that idea was first set out in that text, and we're going to date that text to this particular time, and then you've got a big clash, haven't you? Because you're saying it's not as old as, and a more sort of Indian approach would be, might clash with that. So, and then to come back around to kind of practitioners, when people say, coming up against the works of Norman Sjoman and Mark Singleton, it might feel that those myths are being busted. But I don't read their work in that way at all. And the whole Yoga Karunta Sritattvanidhi that Norman Sjoman was basing his work on. Well, yeah, Jacqueline Hargreaves and Jason Birch are doing such fascinating work on that. And with the Hatha the text, which is it's a written description of 6 sequences of postures, whereas the Sritattvanidhi, which predates the Hatha but only by a little bit, the Sritattvanidhi is an illustrated manual, and they're relatively close. Like you can kind of, put one picture against one description and sort of try and work it out that way. But I think Jason and Jacqueline and Jason have been doing further research on this stuff, and like eyes wide open. Hopefully there'll be more stuff coming from them soon.
Yeah, I had them on the podcast, and I think they spent a couple of days with Norman, and then there was something like this for the last days. I've got something in my attic or something like that. Oh my god, because Norman's this kind of like bumbling old kind of academic. It's like, oh, I think I've got something up there, like they looked at it, it's like, oh wow, this is a huge connection, this is a huge find. On a personal note, I wondered, like, okay, you've been doing this stuff for a number of years. It came out of your interest in practice, that you were a practitioner first and foremost. How has it on a more pragmatic level, how has it actually complemented and enriched your practice, this kind of research? Because another kind of this dichotomy or polarity to draw would be between emic and etic, and the kind of modes of perception, right? So one is reading the text prima facie on face value, and the other is a kind of a critical thinking or a rationalistic perspective and comparative, like reading the text from outside, which we tend to do these days, right? And this is where often you have Indians getting rather upset with Western academics who are reading it and kind of cross-pollinating or making cross connections between text and trying to relate it to other things rather than reading the text on face value. How do these texts inform your practice, and how do you read them?
Okay, good question. So when I first started doing yoga out of as a physical practice, and I hated competitive sports. I was super shy and unconfident, and I absolutely hated my body. And having a mat that I could stay on and I didn't have to get off, and definitely not interact with other people because that's awful, was absolutely fantastic. So I had my mat, I was safe, lighting was dark, and gradually, like through the physical practice, had a wonderful experience, finding out all of these things. Now, but that could have been through sort of running or something else. And I think the magic of yoga is that you scratch the surface and you find a universe. You find this phenomenal literature, these just stunning philosophical systems and metaphysical systems, and you can just plunge so deep. Whereas if it was gymnastics or running or something, I don't think that my interest would have been sustained for this long. I'm less the anatomy and physiology side and more the sort of history and philosophy and metaphysics of it. So it was scratching the surface and then finding this sort of ocean that you could dive into. And then how did the sort of theories in text perhaps inform the physical practice? Well, I'd have to kind of definitely acknowledge Richard Freeman in terms of, I think one of the things he is brilliant at is expressing the teachings in a sort of contemporary poetry that, read Bhagavad Gita chapter 4 with him, sort of pouring the breath into the breath, pouring the inhale into the exhale, the ablation into the ablation, into the ablation. And you can take those sort of ideas and play with them on the mat. You practice with him and then you're like, oh my God, I'm just a whole series of tubes. Look, there's a tube there and there's a tube there and it's all tubes and it's all connected. And look, I'm 70% water, 75% water. And just, and he has you doing breathing practices where you're a fish and you're just like, oh my God, this is just, so I think that within the Indian tradition, we can find some absolutely stunning metaphors within the texts as well that I find can be really productive on the mat in the practice. But I would never go to my mat, recite a verse and say, my intention, I have a sankalpa for my practice, and that it is to think about this. That is guaranteed not to work. I would always just think about something else. But I tend to sort of try and keep it as simple as possible. So it's not like I will be developing this line of inquiry in my practice. Is whatever arises, and then trying to keep it as simple. And, as you go through the Ashtanga practice, it's challenging in so many ways. It's challenging in terms of the complexity and physical difficulty of it. And then after you've done it for a certain number of years, it's challenging in terms of sort of just keeping going and how things evolve and change as well. As one gets older, one's practice changes. I now don't live in London, so I practice at home and kind of top up by going into the shala when I can. Do you want to know my practice hack? This is really bad.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Because it's really hard to do home practice when you're used to practicing in a Mysore environment, which I feel I have done for like my whole yoga life, really. So now, don't tell anyone.
Yeah.
I put techno on or any sort of music with a good beat, and then I get like a podcast or a PDF, and I play it out loud on super fast speed. So it's a little bit hectic. It's not very relaxing.
With the techno as well.
And if you've got, yeah. So you just need to get your levels right so that you're getting a beat. And then I'll have to stop and make notes.
Oh my God, that is brilliant.
Yeah. But like my home practice is
and the podcast is going on fast speed and the techno is going. Wow. Fantastic.
Well, no, the podcast I tend to just play at normal speed, but if you're playing a PDF out loud, you can.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah. What about some lights? Maybe some lights there as well. Some flashing lights.
No, I hadn't thought of that. My kids do have some. Disco
add
lights,
a bit of extra stimulation there. Yeah. Right. So, what about intention? You talked of intention then. So, as you kind of go through reading yoga texts, and we have this, as I mentioned before, these kind of different different templates, really, as you start to kind of really, kind of explore the ideas of yoga. Jim talks, most succinctly and clearly about yoga being basically tapas, an ascetic practice for more of a disjoint or unyoking of the body. And then we have, later on a more kind of body positive spin, really, that we're more keen on today, really, this idea of coming into the body and empowering it kind of in a more tantric way. And then, people get very, very happy about talk of the chakras and the nadis and, kundalini and this kind of thing, right? How has knowing a little bit about the tradition of yoga informed your intentions around it? And have you seen any discrepancies between your approach and what you've been doing or what you've been wanting to do? Can you say anything about that?
I think, maybe? Yeah. I mean, so I practice physical posture. I don't particularly sit. I don't particularly do much pranayama. It's a physical practice. And I think we have to acknowledge the kind of contemporary context in which asana has become the predominant form of yoga. And that is very not that... there are so many discontinuities with the historical tradition in which sitting, mantra, visualization, all those other aspects of the practice were hugely important. So we do have to recognize the discontinuity in why and how in the specific practices that we're doing. Then you have to look at worldview as well. Like, why do we practice yoga? What do we believe in that informs our yoga practice, and then do a bit of historical analysis. So the kind of foundational principles of Indian thought are karma, samsara, dukkha, moksha, that the world is a wheel of becoming, of repeated birth and death that is characterized by suffering, that is propelled by karma, consequential action. And then what we're trying to do is to become free from the round of rebirth. So that's why you do yoga. You do yoga to become free, but particularly in the Hatha Yoga sources, you do yoga to become powerful. And then how does that power play out? What do they mean by that? Well, often in the sources, you've got your siddhis, your superhuman attainments, becoming young, becoming light, small, flying, hearing the sounds of all different things. So you've got all of those siddhis, and you've also got power over. So the yogi develops these powers beyond the human of control over their own body, such that you can take any form at will, bilocate, all of those different things, and power over other people. You become attractive to other people, akarshana. There's this kind of charisma or drawing in. So you power over your own body, power over the people around you, the people and the animals and the kind of beings in the world, and then power over the world itself. You can range through the cosmos. You can become the creation and destruction of the worlds. So that's a whole heap of stuff that that we don't believe in, or that doesn't particularly inform modern yoga practice, where we have a completely different set of worldviews, which is progress, capitalism, neoliberalism. So we're not looking to. Most people don't believe in reincarnation, so we're not looking to come free from the round of rebirth. So slam, we have just cut away one of the foundational reasons that people would have done yoga. So therefore, why are we doing yoga? I think the kind of neoliberal paradigm is so deeply influential that we don't see it. Margaret Thatcher won. We are individuals. We are responsible for our own perfection in the world. We are judged by that. So do yoga to get a good body, to support you to stay in the sausage machine of working and producing. And yoga will enable you to do that, because you'll be able to cope with the stresses and strains of that. You are responsible for looking beautiful and young and the right size and shape. Society will not. No such thing as society. Anyway, slight rant. But therefore, why do we do yoga? We do yoga because
as long as you grew up under Thatcher, you can't,
I'm a Thatcher baby.
I think, well, we were all in it, weren't we? And she did have a big, people outside UK probably won't understand it. Well, look to Reagan, same thing.
Similar.
Maybe not with great hair, not as good hair. And the heels and the blue suits. But what about we can go on about Thatcher. She was a great woman. But if you were in that time and place in the generation, she did define England at the time, and what's gone on since then has been very relevant. To what UK is today. But anyway, that's
politics.
Yeah. We don't need to go down that line. But I think in a way we fall between two stools, don't we? That one is like a rejection of the body and a complete abnegation. So it's kind of ironic when people talk about yoga as union these days, and that's the thing that you hear all the time: yoga is union, and actually it's like, well, generally not. Generally, for most of the time, it's been a kind of rather an escape from. An escape from the body and the kind of union that people are currently. It may be a union with the divine, but not really the union that people are usually talking about when they say yoga is union, which is a kind of quasi, kind of emotional, kind of psychological kind of integration, rather than a union with the divine. People aren't doing yoga to see God anymore, right? And then the other, which is this, empowering the body so it will kind of fly and do all this, kind of wacky stuff that, I think maybe would like to think that, but I think most people probably, or rather they're looking for a further embodiment, probably aren't really going to kind of endorse the fact that they are trying to kind of get superpowers and control of other people's minds, etc. So we kind of fall between two stools in a way, really. And so looking for a precedent as to what we're currently doing is rather, kind of rather difficult, because we are doing something kind of new in a way in terms of most people's aspirations towards yoga. But do you think it has changed at all, your aspirations towards yoga, in learning about the the kind of history and a wider kind of context of it, or not?
Okay, well, there's like I was just looking at the time, because I know you said 40 minutes, and that I could open a massive can of worms at this point.
As long as it's entertaining, then I'm happy to go on. And also, we want to get into the appropriation a bit, which will kind of come from. You could take it from here, really.
That was where I was going to go, in the sense that like, I guess I teach on history and philosophy teacher trainings a bit. I kind of go in and do the history and philosophy modules, and a lot of it is around like, I'm not expecting you to sort of stand up in front of your class and quote chapter and verse and then do some asana. Rather, it's setting out the history, the ways in which these things have developed, in order to understand more about why we're doing this practice, and to just So tarka, the cogitating, thinking, analyzing. I think that is a practice of yoga, as much as meditation, pranayama, mantra, asana. From the Maitreya Upanishad, tarka is one of the limbs of the 6 limbs. So do I see, I guess I'm verging on sort of saying I see academic studies as a form of yoga. I think that critical thinking is a form of yoga. It's not like these are the teachings, believe them. It's like these are the teachings from the teacher, from the text, from the community. Now think about them. And even within Vedanta, Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, we've got manana, think about it. Shravana, listen to it. Manana, think about it. Nididhyasana, meditate on it, contemplate on it more deeply. I just see all of this material as feeding, as kind of nourishing, as fascinating, and as an absolutely integral part of practice that keeps me deeply, deeply fascinated and wanting to continue to study and to do physical practice. I can't wait to finish my thesis, because then I'm just going to practice more. People say that you, like finishing your thesis, you get like post-thesis depression because this thing that you were trying to give birth to for so many years is gone.
Meaning anymore.
I haven't got something to put into that gap. My practice has ailed. It feels like I've been trying to produce a thesis, but it's locked in some kind of weird ongoing childbirth. It's quite traumatic. Anyway, we're going to get there, but I don't actually think I necessarily answered your question. It was, how does all of this stuff feed it, and the kind of cultural appropriation stuff?
Absolutely. I was just kind of reflecting, reading the Bhagavad Gita, actually, how that you've always got this battle in the Bhagavad Gita between which is better, the practice of karma yoga or the practice of jnana yoga, the practice of samkhya, and there's one is basically reflection, isn't it? One is reflection and discrimination, and the other is a practical yoga. And it's like, well, there's always been this kind of attempt then to kind of bridge the two between, because you have to use some sense of discrimination about practice, otherwise it could just be jumping around on the spot, and on the other hand, there's this idea, isn't there, that comes, that's come throughout embodied somatic practices, that there's something in the body to be purged, or I have a problem with the word purified, but that this idea that there's an energy in the body that to be purified, as well as a mental kind of purification going on, and the two have to kind of have some kind of interrelation with each other. Because just mental stuff is like, well, kind of, just like mental masturbation, potentially. And, and physical stuff on its own is just, it's just jumping around doing, some exotic gymnastics, really, or, just for the sake of.
Yeah, well, then you get to the kind of Cartesian split, don't you? Is it mind or body? Can we ever separate those things out? So my thesis introduction does a big, anti-Cartesian stuff that we're all, that it's mind and body already, and then it's also body and yogic body. So it's all one thing. I don't think that the early Hoppe sources make a disconnect between yoga, the normal, the sort of mundane body, and the yogic body, and neither do they particularly make a distinction between the body and the mind. So it's all in the pot. It's all being cooked, as the Yoga Bija would say. Bake the body in the fire of yoga, because unbaked bodies are lumps of meat, and that gnosis alone, meditation alone, will not help, because when you are scratched by ants and bitten by scorpions, attempting to do your meditation, it's not going to work. So therefore, bake the body in the fire of yoga, and you attain a majestic yogic body, a great yogic body, an empowered. But it's not really a yogic body; it's a body. You're developing this amazing body of yoga, which is necessary for doing the contemplation, the gnosis, the jnana yoga. That alone is not enough, because your body causes you pain. Your body is the source of pain. So bake it, which I think Ashtanga Yoga is kind of like got that one nailed, hasn't it? How'd you bake it? Like this.
The kind of heating that goes with a lot of these practices, and the physical heating as well, because there's mental heat, when you're sitting there really trying to think. I mean, I studied philosophy at university, like logic, I remember, just like mental overheating. And then, which is kind of useful in a way, because it feels like a kind of purification of your mind. And then, which mathematicians I really think get, and then you've got the purification of your body when you just do something very hot, that's very consistently disciplined and hot, not just running around a football field and 30 degrees. It doesn't really produce the same effect, or didn't for me. But anything, it's like Bikram. He kind of realized, turn the dial up on the heating, and it kind of works in a different manner here. We wanted to talk a little bit about the appropriation thing, because I want to hear your views on that and what you think of that, because then you we're kind of cut free and loose then, if we haven't got some clear precedent to what we're currently doing, to then interpret it in any way. So I had a conversation a couple of weeks ago, recorded one with an Indian lady practitioner, who was talking about how offensive it is for a lot of Indians to see how yoga is being taken in the West. Yoga for rock hard abs, and yoga for booty, a nice booty, or whatever it is. That we were talking about. And can it? It strikes me as I'm not sure we could ever fully understand it, because it is so culturally embedded. Is there a method that we can extrapolate out that and use it outside a culture, or is it something which really is located within a certain cultural context and an understanding of a worldview?
Oh gosh, that's really so many things there. So I think with the kind of critique of cultural appropriation, or misappropriation of kind of the sort of politics of sort of insult and things like that, I think that's all deeply important, and one mode of response is to study the history of philosophy. So that's kind of tackles the question of like the relevance. What is the relevance of appreciating the historical context of yoga? Well, it's to respond to the risk or fact in some people's perspectives that the way that yoga is practiced is a misappropriate and an offensive one at that. So that's a first point, is take the context seriously. And then you talked on the one hand about sort of like cutting loose. Like, is there something that we're sort of, we can take out of one context, cut loose from that context, and then do within other contexts? Oh, my email has just opened up. I had tried to shut everything down. So I guess that's sort of questions around like essentialism and relativism. Is it still yoga if you've cut it loose from a context? And I really like contexts. I like seeing how things are within certain contexts. So explore the context in which we are doing these practices. That's why the critical theoretical perspective, sort of saying, what are your blind spots? What are your perspectives? What are your, like, okay, we tend perhaps, like, say in the UK, feel sort of like post-religious or something, but what takes up those spaces? What are the worldviews that we're bringing with us that we might not see? So I think critical theory, and I put that in the same bag as kind of tarka, as like critical inquiry into the teachings, like do that. That's a really important part of the yoga practice. Try to see the context. Like critical theory is asking us to look back into our blind spots to see the context in which we are operating. And I think we need to do that within whatever context we're practicing yoga, and then reflect on the context from which yoga has developed. And I'm not saying sort of we should be trying to replicate something, which then, and so the risk of my argument is that you become so relative that if we don't have, if nothing is sacred, then what remains? But I think we have to start from where we are.
And that's, that relativism is it. Yeah, I mean, that would be to be something other than what we are. But on the other hand, we bringing that relativism into yoga is in a certain sense an appropriation itself, isn't it? Because that's our baggage onto yoga. Whereas, critical thinking in the first place is the ability to hold a number of ideas equanimously, a number of ideas at the same time and weigh them up against each other, right? Whereas, yoga thinking really is more based. I mean, look at all the texts. They suggest faith, right? So as long as you've got faith, you've got the obliteration of a whole bunch of different ideas and doubts, and the attempt to hold just one idea at the expense of all others, which is a different model of looking at things, or a way of treating one's own faculties than Western critical thinking on yoga.
So I guess you're sort of positing sort of like Shraddha, or like faith in something. So I don't necessarily see those things as in conflict. I think one can have faith. One can have faith in the teachings. One can have faith in the lineage and the tradition and the community, without saying that like dogma and doctrine is true. We're held within this sort of tradition of practices and people. Yeah, I don't. Yeah, so that would be my response to. I don't think we actually have to. I don't think we have to believe, in a sense, that there are truths that we have to take as absolute, that we can't question. Yeah, I think that they are contextualized. And so one of the problems with cultural appropriation and with yoga as a thing is, what is yoga? And we tend to homogenize and essentialize. So we tend to say there was a historical point at which yoga was yoga, and we should be, that's this anxiety for authenticity, which is a subheading of Mark Singleton's in one of his books, chapter contributions, I think. So, and I just adore it. This idea of an anxiety for authenticity, that we spend so much time doing these things. We're so deeply committed. Yoga is so much kind of part of our lives. But are we doing the right yoga? So let's study the text and find out what the right yoga is. Okay, is it Patanjali yoga? Is that what we should be doing? Well, we shouldn't be doing very much asana then, if that's the case. So yeah, there is, the problem with saying that there is one great yoga is that everything before that was just kind of incrementally leading up to it and isn't somehow valid in its own right, and that everything after that is a degeneration, a sort of polluted, corrupted by external influences. But so what are, I would much prefer to kind of look at the different contexts and look at what and how and why people are doing certain things within certain contexts, and what are the you can do like polythetic analysis, like what are the characteristics within each of those contexts that are the same or different, what are the worldviews that are the same or different. And it's not to kind of judge and to say one thing is better than the other, which is where you then fall into relativism, because you're saying, well, therefore does it just not matter what I'm practicing? If I call it yoga, it's yoga. Yeah, I don't think I would go that far
right.
But I'm really keen not to set up a golden age from which everything is degeneracy. And the problem with the cultural appropriation, there are lots of kind of problems with the sort of arguments around cultural appropriation. But one of which is the ownership paradigm. So if we think we tend to see cultural appropriation within a kind of idea of physical artifacts that can be owned, and that is difficult to then talk about when it's religious, spiritual, and cultural practices, because they don't fit the ownership paradigm in the same way. So that's one of the issues with it. And then another issue is like the sort of essence of the thing. So if we step across into like the heritage sector and museums and restitution, the sending artifacts back to countries, one of the ways in which that idea falters a little bit is you're thinking that the place of origin has not changed, that somehow the place of origin is this homogenous historical continuity that but things change over decades and centuries, and I don't think that there is a homogenized sort of yoga that is yoga. It's context specific, based on the beliefs and practices that people and communities are doing at certain times. So cultural appropriation is a sticky one. And I would hope that one way in which we can sort of acknowledge that, because hurts are a part of this, and so one way in which we can acknowledge this is through study.
And yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting subject, especially for me more recently, traveling more around Southeast Asia and India as well, and coming to India and seeing now how they've adopted, say, we're sitting in a cafe and you're listening to them playing rock songs that I knew, like play very English ones for a certain time and place, right? So they're enjoying them, they're interpreting them, and they're feeling them in a certain manner, right? But one sense a feeling of ownership, from certain London bands, for example, of, well, those are our songs, and that's a small feeling to how maybe an Indian person feels. Is it justified on either side? Do you know what I mean? Because I might not have been, was looking at, say, the Beatles. I wasn't around when they were doing those songs. It's like, and they weren't around when the Indian yogis were sticking, doing their practices. So, so you also talk about homogenized people, and can something be separated from a cultural context? And are they allowed to interpret those songs in their own way, and can they get as much out of those songs as I can because I have a different cultural perspective or context around them?
Are they allowed? So that's the thing, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, there's a number of questions, isn't there? But it definitely sets me up more thinking about it, having seen it from the other side.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the kind of the academic relativism is then that one is attempting not to be judgmental. So I'm just fascinated by how these things are arising in different contexts, rather, and don't feel I have to make any sort of judgment. So the kind of academic perspective, I suppose, is a pursuit of objectivity, which is of course impossible, especially if we have all of these sort of blind spots that may be informing our work that we have perhaps not acknowledged. So academia itself is this kind of process of trying to kind of unpack the context that we're coming from all the time with a kind of attempt towards some sort of objectivity. Oh man, I'm not quite sure where I was going with this. Am I supposed to be answering a question? I've lost myself. But
that's
I
a
guess
difficult one, really, isn't it?
There's kind of no judgment or so the problem with academia is that academics are really good at kind of analyzing and setting out problems, but don't particularly engage in solutions. And academia has not always functioned as a site for the production of solutions. It's functioned as the site for kind of knowledge generation and criticism, but not sort of political engagement necessarily. And I guess where you were coming at with your questions, that was more of a kind of, what is the solution? And I don't think there is one solution. And I think academics are a bit cheeky, but I'm going to take that route out, which is, it's not really for me to posit the solution, and it's seeing that contexts are complicated because they're people. We're all complicated. We all have our different takes and contexts.
Well, I think that's a pop out, isn't it?
Ooh, do you?
No. No, I mean, it's a difficult one. But I mean, look, for example, one of the videos I get the most slack on is Edwin Bryant, a lovely guy and friend of mine, talking about Yoga Sutras or Bhagavad Gita, right? I mean, he's a super well-known academic. He's done his stuff on it, I mean, if anyone has authority to talk on these texts, it's probably Edwin. He's learned the Sanskrit. He does from the original text, but you'll have constant Indians fighting back on this. Look, this is a white guy talking about our culture, and I can understand the point. I can understand it. I mean, can you ever? I mean, so the point goes deeper. I'm not expecting an answer from you, but can someone really from the outside ever fully understand which goes deeper than that in a way? There's some sense of ownership or culture surrounding this thing. So we're always kind of looking at it from the outside in a way. But on the other hand, I mean, Edwin will know these texts way better than most Indians will. So, he's also justified to speak on them, And again, like, it's not something I expect you to have an answer on, but it's an interesting thing to reflect upon, I suppose.
Yeah. No, I don't think I have an answer. There's a book by Johannan Grinchapon about the Yoga Sutra called Silence Unheard. And one thing that he does at the beginning, which I think is really nice, is he's sort of doing a literature review, and he creates stereotypes to do the literature review with. So he's like, well, there's the disinterested outsider, there's the practitioner outsider, and I think he does some really helpful work there in analyzing the different relationships that people can have with the topics that they're studying. Because I don't think there is one answer. And I think that way of kind of seeing it in those different ways is quite helpful. But I do find his book really hard. And I have tried reading a few paragraphs at a time after drinking an espresso. And then you sort of have to stop reading and go and lie down in a dark room for a while. But I recommend it.
Maybe you need the techno going on in the background. Maybe the techno would help as well. You just put that on, and the espresso. Yeah, I mean, it's a cliche, isn't it? But the more this is, talked about, and people can hold, and tolerate other people's opinions on these subjects as simply just reflections, then it's probably a positive thing, because I mean, Edwin's done a huge amount of service to the yoga tradition, and and yet he's not necessarily claiming to be the last word on what yoga is, and also people growing up in India with a cultural understanding of yoga will have that emotional resonance, which goes super deep and is different to an understanding which is always going to be from the outside perspective, right? Like, you'll never understand the Smiths in such a way, even from me from London, for example, and it's a silly example, I know the music one, but in a way that someone who's grown up in that area of Manchester would understand, you know what I mean? Like, it's going to be an emotional understanding. You can analyze that music all you like, but it's not going to be the same thing. And it just, I don't know. It struck me as pertinent one day.
Talk about academia, like, especially when you're kind of thinking about doing your literature review, because as you start a project, you find the literature, read the literature, and and then the idea is it's like a conversation. This conversation has been going on for decades, for centuries. And you're trying to kind of, it's like walking into a room where everyone's been speaking and they all know what they're talking about and you don't know what's going on. And you're trying to kind of get up to speed with that conversation and to work out whether you have any sort of contribution. But it's not like any of those. Yeah. So I'd see it as a kind of continuous flow of dialogue through time. I think that's what academia is if you sort of take that metaphor of the conversation, and as a PhD student, you're sort of trying to jump into that conversation and sort of hoping that you're going to land in it okay. But I mean, who's got the last word, I guess, is the point. Like, does anybody have the last word in this? It's going to continue, isn't it? Who is most entitled to speak, and should everyone else shut up? Well, the conversation is going to keep flowing.
Yeah. Yeah. Is it the same as a German person being justified in having the last word on Nietzsche, for example, or, whatever, I mean, it's well, we've opened a discussion there, and I suppose, this will continue, and I think we can carry on and on with this, but I think I'll leave it there for now and just say, thanks very much, Ruth, for your time. And look, let's just lighten the tone and just say, look, I always do this on the podcast. Give me a guilty pleasure and an inspiration, just to finish it off and end on a slightly lighter note. Yeah, I often do this. So one inspiration, don't think too hard about it. Something inspires you, person, place, or thing, and a guilty pleasure. And as long as you don't say chocolate, I'm good with that.
Oh, right. Well, coffee. I don't know if that's a guilty pleasure, but I think
that's all right. Yeah,
I'll go.
I'll go with that. Well, yeah.
I can't function without it.
Yes,
but I suppose I feel guilty. Inspiration. I don't know if there's I'm inspired by the people who have gone before, and I sort of say that in a really sort of personal way. The people that are no longer with us.
Yeah. That's nice. That's a nice ending. All right. Well, thank you very much, Ruth, for joining me and giving me your time. So we've had a great conversation. And as always, please feel free to comment on this as long as it's nice. Thanks very much. And thanks, Ruth, again. Thank you.
Thanks, Adam. Pleasure to join you today.